There was a clock on the mantelpiece in the dead man's sitting room, and it was showing the wrong time, though no one had thought to ask why. Miss Marple noticed it the moment she stepped through the door, the way one notices a word spelt incorrectly in an otherwise tidy letter. Welcome to Cozy Pages, where every quiet night holds a story, and every page carries a gentle mystery. Settle in, get comfortable, and let the story unfold. Chapter 1. The village at 3:30, the village of Chipping Hurst, had a particular smell in late September something between wood smoke and the last of the sweet peas, which Mrs. Hartley at number 4 always grew rather too enthusiastically along her front wall. By this time of year they were collapsing gently into themselves, perfuming the lane with a sweetness that was really just past its best, like a waltz played a little too slowly. The mornings had turned sharp and thin. The afternoons arrived with a golden quality that made everyone feel vaguely melancholy without quite knowing why. Miss Marple had come to stay with her old friend Dorothy Melrose for a fortnight, nothing more dramatic than that. Dorothy had recently had a small operation on her knee and required, as she put it, someone sensible nearby who would not fuss. Miss Marple was eminently sensible, rarely fussed, and was additionally fond of Dorothy's garden, which contained a particularly fine late-flowering clematis that she had always admired from a distance and now intended to observe closely. The village was not St. Mary Mead, but it had the same feeling of a place that knew itself thoroughly. The post office was run by a Mrs. Partridge, who had been running it for 31 years and regarded this tenure as a kind of sacred trust. The church, St. Cuthbert's, had a vicar named Hadley, who delivered sermons of exactly the right length, long enough to seem serious, short enough to seem wise. There was a public house called the Barleycorn, a butcher who whistled, and a schoolmistress who did not. Dorothy Melrose's cottage, called Wisteria End, sat at the quieter end of the High Street, its garden surrounded by a low stone wall over which the aforesaid Clematis tumbled in autumn lavender. Miss Marple had arrived on the Monday, and by Wednesday had established herself comfortably in the small bedroom overlooking the back garden, had found the best chair by the sitting-room fire, and had taken 2 gentle walks down to the village green and back. It was on one of these walks, on Wednesday afternoon, that she first became aware of the Crewe house. It sat just beyond the turning to Millgate Lane, a solid, handsome Victorian house called Hawthorne Lodge, somewhat larger than its neighbours and somewhat more enclosed. Its garden was immaculate in the way that suggests professional attention rather than personal affection. The hedges were perfect right angles. The lawn showed no evidence of weeds, or indeed of any living thing that had not been expressly permitted to grow there. A man was standing at the front gate when Miss Marple passed. He was perhaps 60, rather heavily built, with the sort of face that had been handsome once and now settled into something more watchful. He was looking at nothing in particular, or rather, he was looking in the manner of a man who is thinking hard about something and using the middle distance as a convenient screen upon which to project his thoughts. Miss Marple wished him good afternoon. He started slightly, as people do when they have been far away inside themselves, then returned a polite nod and a brief good afternoon of his own. She walked on. Behind her she heard the gate click shut. That evening, over a lamb chop and the last of the runner beans, Dorothy mentioned him almost in passing, the way one mentions things that have been sitting quietly at the back of one's mind, waiting for an appropriate moment. "That's Mr. Gerald Crewe," Dorothy said, cutting her lamb with the careful precision of someone whose knee still required her to remain seated longer than she liked. "He came about 3 years ago, retired from something in finance. Widower, keeps very much to himself, which people have never quite decided whether to find dignified or unfriendly." "Does he have family?" Miss Marple asked. "A son," Dorothy said. "Simon comes occasionally. They are not, I think, entirely comfortable together. Though I may be wrong. One often is." Miss Marple considered this. The clematis on the back wall moved slightly in the evening air, and somewhere down the lane a dog began, and then thought better of it. She said nothing more about Gerald Crewe that evening, but she thought, as she often did, that the way a man stands at his own gate and stares at nothing in particular can tell you quite a great deal about the shape of his inner weather. Chapter 2. The business of other people's lives Thursday came in with low cloud and a suggestion of rain that never entirely fulfilled its promise, drifting instead into a damp greyness that settled over the village like a second-best blanket. Miss Marple spent the morning in the garden with Dorothy, who had been confined to a garden chair with a rug over her knee and a cup of tea growing cold beside her while she directed operations. "The dahlias want cutting back," Dorothy said, with the authority of a woman who has been cutting dahlias back for 40 years and knows exactly what they want even when she cannot do it herself. "I see that," said Miss Marple, who was examining the dahlia bed with the concentration she brought to all physical evidence. "Though this one here has another week in it, I think." "I dare say you're right. You usually are, which is occasionally tiresome." Miss Marple smiled and snipped the dahlia, taking it with her. It was later that morning that she encountered Mrs. Partridge. The post office occupied a converted cottage at the north end of the High Street, its window displaying a hand-lettered notice about parcel collection and a small display of birthday cards that had been there long enough to have faded at the edges. Mrs. Partridge herself stood behind the counter with the patient alertness of a woman accustomed to being the first person in any village to know anything. She was perhaps 65, with tightly curled grey hair and sharp eyes behind her glasses that suggested she catalogued everything she saw and filed it for later use. "Miss Marple, isn't it? Dorothy Melrose's friend?" Mrs. Partridge said, in the tone of someone who knows perfectly well who one is but prefers to open conversations with a small formality. "That's right," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "I've come for a book of stamps. And also I wonder if you might have any of those nice padded envelopes my nephew expects a small parcel." Mrs. Partridge produced both items with the smooth competence of long practice. "Settling in all right, are you? Chipping Hurst isn't St. Mary Mead, of course, but we manage." "It's a lovely village," Miss Marple said, meaning it entirely. "We have our dramas," Mrs. Partridge said, with the modest satisfaction of someone reporting that their village does in fact produce its share of the human condition. "You may have seen Hawthorne Lodge Gerald Crewe's place. There's been a certain amount of talk." "Has there?" Miss Marple kept her voice entirely neutral, which was the only way to invite confidence without appearing to solicit it. "His son arrived on Monday. Simon and Gerald have not, historically speaking, been what you'd call close. There was a business matter some years back, no one knows the full story, but it left a mark. And now suddenly Simon appears and stays, which he hasn't done since Christmas 2 years ago at least. One wonders what's brought him. Perhaps simply a desire to see his father," Miss Marple suggested. Mrs. Partridge gave her a look that conveyed, with perfect economy, that this explanation was available but not entirely satisfying. On her way back, Miss Marple paused again near Hawthorne Lodge. The curtains in the front room were drawn, which was unusual at 10:30 in the morning. A car she had not seen before a dark saloon, fairly new, sat on the gravel drive. Someone had left a pair of gardening gloves on top of the gatepost. They were large gloves, clearly a man's, and the right one was inside out, as though removed hastily and dropped there without thought. Miss Marple walked on. Small things, she had learned long ago, are rarely only themselves. Chapter 3. A death in excellent standing Gerald Crewe was found dead on Friday morning. The discovery was made by his daily woman, a capable and unflappable person named Mrs. Greer, who arrived at 8 o'clock as she always did, let herself in with her key, found the kettle not yet boiled, and then found Mr. Crewe in his sitting-room armchair with a quality of stillness about him that was unmistakably final. She did not scream. Mrs. Greer was not a screaming sort of woman. She went to the telephone in the hallway and rang the doctor, and then she sat down in the kitchen and made herself a cup of tea with someone else's kettle, because something has to be done with one's hands at moments like that. The village knew by 9 o'clock, which is the natural speed of such knowledge, in a place where everyone walks past everyone else's house before breakfast. Dorothy heard it from her neighbour Mrs. Fenn, who heard it from the butcher's boy, who had heard it at the bakery. Gerald Crewe, Dorothy said, setting down her toast with the gravity the news deserved. Good heavens. He wasn't old, 62, perhaps, 63 at most. And his son is still in the village? Miss Marple asked. Simon? Yes, apparently he'd been staying at the Barleycorn rather than at the house, which tells its own story, I suppose. He'll have to sort through everything now. Miss Marple said nothing to this. She finished her breakfast thoughtfully. The doctor, a young man named Fellows, who had only been in the village 18 months, and still approached everything with a certain careful thoroughness that the older villagers found either admirable or exhausting, depending on their temperament, had given it as his initial view that the cause was cardiac. Gerald Crewe had been under observation for a heart condition for some years, and the evidence was consistent. But Dr. Fellows was, as noted, a careful man. He requested a post-mortem. This detail reached Miss Marple at 11:30 via Mrs. Partridge, who had apparently spoken to the doctor's receptionist, who had relayed the information in the strictest confidence to 3 people. She considered it whilst pruning the rose against the back wall. The Clematis could wait. It was not uncommon for doctors to request post-mortems in cases of sudden death, even expected ones. It was prudent. It meant nothing, necessarily, and yet. She thought about the gardening gloves on the gatepost, one inside out. She thought about the curtains drawn at 10:30 in the morning. She thought about Simon Crewe arriving after 2 years' absence, staying not at his father's house but at the pub. And she thought about Gerald Crewe standing at his own gate the previous afternoon, staring at the middle distance with the look of a man who has been given something to think about that he would rather not have been given. There are moments when a collection of small facts arranges itself, not into a conclusion, but into the shape of a question. This was one of those moments. Dorothy, she said, going inside, do you know anything about Gerald Crewe's affairs? Financial affairs, I mean. Dorothy looked up from her crossword. Not in detail. He was careful with money. Perhaps more than careful, Philip Hadley, the vicar, mentioned once that Gerald had been rather sharp with him over a matter of the church roof fund. Something about the accounting. Gerald didn't say it in a rude way, apparently, just in a way that made Philip feel he was being examined. How interesting, said Miss Marple quietly, and picked up her knitting. Chapter 4. The son who stayed at the pub Simon Crewe was 34 and had the slightly hollowed look of a man who sleeps badly, and has done so for long enough that it no longer seems remarkable to him. He had his father's build broad through the shoulder, but none of his father's watchfulness. Where Gerald Crewe had been self-contained, Simon seemed instead contained by something external, held in by the effort of presenting a normal face to normal situations. Miss Marple encountered him at the Barleycorn on Friday afternoon. She had gone in for a small glass of dry sherry Dorothy had run out, and Miss Marple had no objection to collecting it in person, since it gave one the opportunity to observe a room. Simon was at the bar with a glass of something amber in front of him, and the posture of a man who has nowhere in particular to be, and is not sure how he feels about that. The landlord, a Mr. Briggs, made the introduction in the easy way of pub landlords, who regard everyone in their establishment as having consented, implicitly, to human contact. Mr. Crewe, this is Miss Marple. She's staying with Dorothy Melrose. Miss Marple, Simon Crewe, his father, was Gerald Crewe, God rest him, up at Hawthorne Lodge. I'm so very sorry, Miss Marple said, with the simple directness she brought to all condolences. It must be a great shock. Simon turned to look at her. He had grey eyes, slightly reddened at the edges, though whether from grief or poor sleep or something else she could not immediately say. Yes, he said. Though I suppose the heart thing. It was always possible. Had he seemed well recently? I hadn't seen him since it's been a while. He looked at his glass. We weren't close. Recently, I'm sorry for that too, Miss Marple said, meaning it in the particular way she always meant condolences for estrangements, which she had always found a heavier grief in some ways than ordinary bereavement. Simon looked at her with the faint surprise people sometimes showed when an elderly woman said something that landed precisely. You're perceptive, he said. I've had a long time to observe people, she said pleasantly. May I ask, were you planning to stay on for a while, or I need to sort out the estate? There's the house to deal with. His solicitor rang this morning. He paused, and I need to understand, I need to know what was going on. Going on? He seemed to consider whether to say more, then appeared to decide, in the arbitrary way of tired people, that it didn't much matter either way. My father rang me 3 weeks ago, out of the blue. We hadn't spoken properly in over 2 years. There was a falling out over a business thing. But he rang me and said he needed to see me. Said there was something he'd found out, something he needed to sort. And he wanted to make things right between us before he did whatever he was going to do. And you came. I came Monday. He was not as I remembered. Thinner, quieter. We had dinner, and he started to tell me something, but then he stopped and said he wasn't ready yet, that he needed another day to be sure. Simon turned his glass on the bar mat. He died Thursday night. Miss Marple let this sit for a moment. The fire at the end of the bar crackled once and settled. Did he give you any indication of the nature of what he'd found out? Simon glanced at her. He mentioned a name. Arthur Pym. Does that mean anything to you? No, said Miss Marple. But I have only been in Chipping Hurst since Monday. He mentioned it carefully, Simon said, as if the name itself was dangerous. Chapter 5. The name that was mentioned carefully, Arthur Pym, it turned out, was not a hard man to learn about in Chipping Hurst, provided one went about it in the right way, which is to say without appearing to go about it at all. Miss Marple went about it via the simple method of mentioning to Mrs. Partridge the following morning that she had met poor Mr. Crewe's son at the pub, and what a dreadful thing. And wasn't it a small world? And did Mrs. Partridge know if Mr. Crewe had had many friends in the village, because the son seemed quite isolated? And Mrs. Partridge was, as always, admirably forthcoming. Arthur Pym had lived in Chipping Hurst for 7 years. He was approximately 55, unmarried, and ran a small financial consultancy from a converted outbuilding behind his house, a house called, with what Miss Marple felt was a certain optimism. The outlook. He had initially been friendly and sociable, had joined the parish council, had attended the summer fete, had bought drinks at the right moments. Over the past year or so, however, he had withdrawn somewhat. There had been a matter, and here Mrs. Partridge lowered her voice in a way that conveyed that the matter was being related in the strictest confidence, involving the local investment club. Investment club? Miss Marple said. 6 or 7 of the village's more financially comfortable residents. Gerald Crewe was one of them, also Harriet Vine from the old rectory, and Colonel Sefton, and Dr. Philpott, the retired dentist, and his wife. Arthur Pym had been managing their combined fund for the past 3 years. An informal arrangement, no proper contract, just a signed agreement among themselves. These things do get informal when people trust each other. And the trust had been misplaced? Mrs. Partridge compressed her lips in a manner that expressed an entire editorial position. Gerald Crewe had begun to have doubts. He was good with figures. He asked Pym for a full accounting about 6 weeks ago, and Pym gave him one, but Gerald wasn't satisfied. Told Harriet Vine privately that the numbers didn't add up the way they should. Had he spoken to a solicitor? That I don't know. But I know this, and you won't have heard this anywhere else. Last week Gerald Crewe rang Plym's landline 3 times in one day. The third call lasted 40 minutes. My sister-in-law lives next door to Plym's office, and she heard not the words, you understand, but the tone. And the tone was not friendly. Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Partridge for the stamps she had come to purchase. She was running low, and walked back to Wisteria End with the unhurried step of someone who has found what she was looking for, and has no reason to rush. Arthur Pym. A name mentioned carefully, as though it were dangerous. She thought about Gerald Crewe's expression at the gate, the expression of a man in the middle of something difficult, something that required nerve. She thought about his phone call to his son. I found something out. I need to sort it. I need another day to be sure. He had not had another day. Sitting in the best chair that evening with her knitting, and the small fire Dorothy had been persuaded to light, despite the calendar still saying September, Miss Marple considered the shape of things. There were several explanations for a man with a heart condition dying in his armchair. The most likely was still the simplest. Hearts gave out, particularly hearts already under strain, particularly in men who were, perhaps, under considerable additional stress. But Dr. Fellows had asked for a post-mortem. And the clock on the mantelpiece, according to Mrs. Greer, who had mentioned it to the butcher, who had mentioned it to Dorothy's neighbour, had been showing 6:15 when she found him at 8 on Friday morning. Gerald Crewe was, by all accounts, a man of precise habits. He wound his clocks himself. He always had. Chapter 6. What a Clock Says About a Man. The post-mortem results came back on Monday. They came back, strictly speaking, only to the authorities, and Miss Marple was not among those authorities. But she heard about them, because she was by now on sufficiently comfortable terms with Mrs. Partridge that information of community significance was shared between them in the normal way of neighbours who take a mutual interest in the well-being of the village. The cause of death had been confirmed as cardiac arrest, but the pathologist, a scrupulous woman based in the county town, had noted elevated levels of a substance in the bloodstream, a substance called digoxin. Digoxin, Miss Marple knew, was a medication used in the management of heart conditions. Gerald Crewe had indeed been prescribed it. Its presence was not unusual, except the levels were higher than a prescribed dose would explain. Not dramatically not the levels of a crude poisoning in a detective novel, but higher, measurably higher than they should have been in a man taking his medication correctly. The police had been notified. They were treating this as a matter requiring further investigation, which was the form of words used when the police were not yet committing to a particular position, but were also not closing any doors. Miss Marple sat with this information for a full afternoon, knitting a pale blue cardigan for her great niece, and watching the way the light moved across Dorothy's garden as the afternoon wore on. The dahlias she had left another week were now ready to be cut. The Clematis had 3 more flowers than it had had on Monday. Digoxin overdose, even modest overdose, was not always accidental. It was also not always deliberate. It was the kind of thing that could happen if a person forgot they had already taken their medication and took it again. It was the kind of thing that could happen if the dose had been recently increased and the body had not adjusted. And it was, of course, the kind of thing that could happen if someone else had ensured the dose was rather higher than prescribed. The clock. She needed to think carefully about the clock. Mrs. Greer, interviewed by the police on Saturday morning, had confirmed that she found Mr. Crewe at 8 o'clock. She had found the kettle unboiled, the sitting-room light still on, and the clock on the mantelpiece showing 6:15. She had noticed the clock because she was, as she put it, a clock-noticing sort of person. Her own house had 7 of them, and 6:15 was wrong, because Mr. Crewe always wound his clocks on Thursday evenings before bed, and they were always right. Dorothy, Miss Marple said, setting down her knitting that evening. Did Gerald Crewe take his digoxin in the morning or the evening? Dorothy blinked. What an odd question. How would I know? Did he ever mention his medication? It would have come up with his heart. People do talk about these things, particularly as one gets older. He mentioned the heart condition once at a dinner party at the Vines, said something about managing it with medication and having to be careful about, I think he said, grapefruit. Something about grapefruit interacting with the medication. Grapefruit, Miss Marple said. There are substances that interact with digoxin, increasing its effect. Grapefruit is one. Certain other things are as well, things rather more easy to administer without notice than a grapefruit. The clock had stopped at 6:15, or had been stopped, or had been altered, and Gerald Crewe had not wound it that Thursday evening, because he had been, by that hour, already dying. Chapter 7. Tea with Harriet Vine. Harriet Vine lived at the old rectory, a house of considerable size that she occupied with the brisk efficiency of a woman accustomed to large spaces and disinclined to be diminished by them. She was 68, a widow with silver hair worn short, and the kind of posture that suggested she had been told to stand up straight at an early age and had never once forgotten. Miss Marple had been introduced to her at church on Sunday by Dorothy, and Mrs. Vine had invited them both to tea on Tuesday with the decisiveness of a woman who regards hospitality as a matter to be organised rather than merely intended. The old rectory's drawing room was pleasant in a rather formal way, well proportioned, adequately heated, with flowers arranged in the manner of someone following a principle rather than an impulse. Tea was served with precision, the right cups, the right biscuits, the right temperature of pot. "We shall all miss Gerald terribly," Mrs. Vine said, pouring with a steady hand that betrayed nothing except long practice. "He was the most sensible person in any room he occupied, which is rarer than it sounds." "Had you seen him recently?" Miss Marple asked. "Last week, actually, Thursday, we had lunch. He rang on Wednesday and suggested it, which was slightly unusual. Gerald wasn't impulsive about these things, but I was glad to have seen him." This detail settled into the room quietly. Thursday, the day he died. Gerald Crewe had lunched with Harriet Vine on the last day of his life. "He seemed well?" Miss Marple asked. "He seemed purposeful," Mrs. Vine said, after a moment. "That's the word. He said something at lunch that I've been turning over ever since. He said that it was important to do the right thing, even when the cost was high. And then he changed the subject and asked about my rose arbour, and that was that." "Did he mention Arthur Pym?" "A beat. Small but detectable." "Why do you ask that?" "Because I've heard the name in connection with Gerald, and I'm trying to understand," Miss Marple said, which was perfectly true. Harriet Vine set down her cup with the particular care of someone buying time. Gerald had some concerns about Arthur's management of our investment fund. He'd asked for a full audit, and Arthur had provided one, but Gerald said the numbers had discrepancies. He intended to confront Arthur formally. "He told me this at lunch." "He told you specifically? At lunch on Thursday?" "He said he had gathered enough evidence. He said he would be speaking to a solicitor on Friday morning." She paused. He did not reach Friday morning. The room was quiet for a moment. The mantelpiece clock ticked with the complacency of a clock that had never been tampered with. Was Arthur Pym aware that Gerald was gathering evidence? Mrs. Vine met her eyes steadily. "That would depend on whether Gerald had said anything to him directly. Which I don't know. I only know what Gerald told me." She paused again. "I have been thinking since the police spoke to me yesterday that I ought to examine my own instincts about all of this rather carefully. And I have. And I believe Gerald Crewe did not die of natural causes. I believe you are right," Miss Marple said simply. "Now, tell me everything Gerald said at lunch. Every detail, however small. Let us start at the beginning. Chapter 8. The man from the Outlook, Arthur Pym, was a compact, well-maintained sort of man, the kind who seems at first glance entirely ordinary, which in Miss Marple's considerable experience often means that some effort has been put into appearing so. He had neat dark hair going grey at the temples, a good coat, and the manner of someone accustomed to being found reassuring, which is a manner that must be consciously cultivated, because it does not come naturally to anyone. Miss Marple encountered him on Wednesday morning in the most natural way possible. He was leaving the post office as she was entering it, and they held the door for each other with the mutual courtesy of English strangers who recognise that doors exist for the benefit of all. "Good morning," he said, with a smile that was warm and entirely correct. "Good morning," she replied, and went in. She completed her small business with Mrs. Partridge and emerged to find him standing in the lane looking at the display in the bakery window with no particular urgency. "Dreadful about poor Gerald," he said when she came alongside, as though they had been in the middle of a conversation. "Very dreadful," she agreed. "Very sharp, financially, perhaps too sharp for his own peace of mind, if you know what I mean, the sort who worries about figures even when there's nothing to worry about." This was said pleasantly, as though it was sympathy. It was not sympathy. "Were you close?" she asked. "We had business dealings. The investment club, perhaps you've heard. Small village thing, nothing grand. Gerald was one of the members. He'd had some questions about returns lately, which is understandable given market conditions. We'd been working through it. He seemed satisfied?" A small pause. "Very small. I think so. We'd spoken last week. I think he was coming round to understanding the context. This was almost certainly untrue, based on everything she had learned from Harriet Vine and Simon Crewe and Mrs. Partridge, but it was said with the fluent ease of someone who had said untrue things before and found them hold. "His son is still in the village," Miss Marple said quite mildly. "Yes, Simon, I haven't spoken with him." The pleasant manner remained, but something underneath it had shifted very slightly the way a smooth road sometimes reveals, under close inspection, a hairline crack. "I imagine he'll be going through Gerald's papers." "I imagine so," Miss Marple said. She walked on. She did not look back, but she had the distinct impression that Arthur Plym stood in the lane, watching her go for rather longer than the situation required. That afternoon she asked Simon Crewe to come to tea. He came at 4 o'clock, looking somewhat better than he had at the pub, or at least differently worn, as though the particular exhaustion of the first shock had been replaced by the different exhaustion of purpose. "Your father's papers," she said, passing him a cup. "Have you had access to them yet? His solicitor is coming tomorrow, but I've been in the house, the police have released it. I've had a look through his desk." He paused. He had a file, labelled in his handwriting App Queries. It contained 8 months of correspondence and annotated statements. He was thorough. "Yes," said Miss Marple. "He seems to have been a thorough man." "Was the file intact?" Simon looked at her. The filing cabinet had been opened. "I don't know if anything was removed. I can't know what should be there." He set down his cup. Someone had a key to that house. Chapter 9. A Key and its Implications a Key to Hawthorne Lodge. Miss Marple considered this carefully, as one considers something sharp that must be picked up at the right point. Gerald Crewe was a precise man who controlled his environment carefully. He had a daily woman with a key. He had, presumably, a key of his own. And who else? Mrs. Greer the daily woman was, on the evidence of everything Miss Marple had learned, a model of steady reliability. She had worked for Gerald Crewe for 3 years, arrived at 8, left at midday, and confined herself with absolute professionalism to the work she was paid for. She had her key. She had also, on the morning of finding him, not touched anything except the telephone and the kettle. But the filing cabinet had been opened, and the clock showed the wrong time. Thursday evening. Gerald Crewe dined alone on Thursdays. Mrs. Greer confirmed this to the police, who mentioned it in the hearing of enough people that it arrived in Wisteria End's kitchen by Thursday of the following week, which was the speed. Miss Marple reflected, at which this village processed its facts. Alone on Thursday evening. So someone had come to him, or he had admitted someone, between the time Mrs. Greer left at noon and the time Gerald Crewe died, which the post-mortem placed between 9 and 11 on Thursday evening. He had admitted them willingly, she thought. The front door showed no signs of disturbance, which would have been mentioned. A man of Gerald Crewe's habits did not open his door to strangers after dark. It was someone he knew. She thought about the investment club. Gerald Crewe, Harriet Vine, Colonel Sefton, Dr. Philpott and his wife, Arthur Plym, who managed the fund and was not himself a member, but was, so to speak, the custodian of their collective trust. She thought about Arthur Plym's carefully constructed manner, about the phrase working through it, deployed so smoothly, about the way he had said, "I imagine he'll be going through Gerald's papers," with a particular flatness, as though the papers were a matter of technical interest rather than personal alarm. She needed to know about the key. Dorothy, it turned out, knew rather more about the household arrangements at Hawthorne Lodge than one might have expected, having once been asked to feed Gerald Crewe's cat during a week's absence, and having handled the spare key for that purpose. "He gave you a spare key?" "For the cat. I gave it back when he returned. He was very particular about getting it back, quite insisted, which I didn't find offensive, because I could see it was simply how he was." "Did anyone else, to your knowledge, have a spare?" Dorothy considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "Mrs. Greer has one. And I believe this is 2 years ago now. I believe Gerald mentioned that Simon had one. For emergencies. He wasn't sure Simon still had it. He mentioned it in a slightly doubtful way, as though he wasn't certain whether he'd asked for it back or not. Simon, who had arrived Monday. Who was staying at the pub because he and his father were not easy together. Who, by his own account, had not spoken to his father properly for 2 years. Miss Marple thought about Simon's grey eyes, reddened at the edges. She thought about the way he had said we weren't close. Recently she thought about his description of his father's tone on the phone. He sounded frightened. And then she thought about something else. Something that had been sitting at the back of her mind since Monday like a word on the tip of the tongue. Simon Crewe had arrived on Monday. Gerald Crewe's body was found Friday. The phone call had been 3 weeks ago. Between Monday and Thursday, in 3 days of halting, careful conversation, Gerald had started to tell his son something and then stopped, saying he needed another day. Until Thursday, when he did not dine with Simon, but lunched instead with Harriet Vine. Why did he lunch with Harriet Vine on the last afternoon of his life, and not with his son? Chapter 10. What Harriet Vine remembered the answer came partly from Harriet Vine and partly from Miss Marple's own long experience of the way people behave when they are afraid. She rang Mrs. Vine on Thursday morning and was invited back to the old rectory that afternoon for what Mrs. Vine described as a working conversation, which Miss Marple found both apt and rather admirable. The drawing-room was the same, the tea was the same temperature. But Mrs. Vine was different. The careful composure of Tuesday was still present, but had been inhabited differently, as though she had spent the intervening time making certain decisions. "I've spoken to the police again," she said, as she poured. "I've told them everything I told you, and rather more. I should have done so earlier. I was being cautious where I should have been clear." "That is understandable," Miss Marple said. "Gerald told me at lunch on Thursday that he had decided not to tell Simon the full story yet. He was protecting him." She paused. The business matter 2 years ago, the falling out. It involved Arthur Pym. Simon had introduced Pym to Gerald, you see. Simon had met him at some investment conference and thought highly of him. It was Simon who brought Pym into the group. The shape of things rearranged itself slightly. Miss Marple set down her cup. So the falling out between Gerald and Simon was partly about Pym. Gerald began to have doubts about Pym roughly 18 months ago, and he shared those doubts with Simon, expecting Simon to take them seriously. Instead, Simon defended Pym rather strongly. They quarrelled. Gerald felt let down. They stopped speaking. And now Gerald had gathered evidence that Pym was indeed fraudulent. Yes, and he was, I think, uncertain how Simon would react to being shown that he'd been wrong. Or worse, he was uncertain whether Simon was innocent of knowing. That was what was eating at Gerald. He didn't tell Simon the full story because he didn't know yet whether Simon was a victim or something else. This was it. This was the source of the careful pauses, the not yet, I need another day to be sure. "But he told you," Miss Marple said. "He trusted me to be objective. He said his exact words. He said, 'Harriet, I need to tell someone who isn't in the middle of it.'" She looked at her hands. He was going to the solicitor Friday morning. He was going to set everything in motion. He was also going to tell Simon, that evening, everything, on Friday evening. Yes, Gerald Crewe had known who the enemy was. He had made his plan. He had set it for Friday morning with the solicitor, Friday evening with his son. And sometime Thursday night, between 9 and 11, he had died. "Mrs. Vine," Miss Marple said carefully, "when Gerald left you after lunch on Thursday, did he mention expecting a visitor that evening?" Harriet Vine was very still. He said yes. He said Arthur Pym had telephoned him that morning, wanted to come and discuss the accounts face to face. Gerald said he had agreed to it because he wanted to see how Pym would behave when cornered. He described himself as cornering Pym. His word was cornered. Yes, he seemed not frightened. Determined, she paused. Perhaps he should have been frightened. Chapter 11. The question of the prescription Miss Marple required one more piece of information, and she required it from Dr. Fellows, which presented a certain delicacy since Dr. Fellows was a medical professional, and medical professionals are properly cautious about discussing their patients. However, Miss Marple had learned long ago that there is a difference between asking a doctor for information and asking a doctor a question, to which the answer, if they give it, confirms a direction of thought that is already on the available evidence pointing somewhere clear. She presented herself at the surgery on Friday morning, nominally on the matter of a small scrape on her hand from a rose thorn, which was genuine enough that it required no particular invention. Dr. Fellows was indeed careful and thorough. He dressed the scrape with more attention than it strictly required, which Miss Marple found both admirable and convenient. "You were Gerald Crewe's doctor," she said, as he applied the dressing, gently, as though this was simply the natural continuation of their conversation. One of them. He also had a cardiologist in the county town. He said this with the careful neutrality of someone who knows perfectly well why the question is being asked. "I only ask because I understand the post-mortem showed elevated digoxin levels, and I wondered purely as a layman, you understand whether that might be consistent with a recently changed prescription." Dr. Fellows paused. He applied a neat strip of tape to the dressing and sat back. "I've already spoken to the police about this. I can tell you, because it will be a matter of public record in due course, that Mr. Crewe's prescription had not been changed recently. The dosage was stable. The levels found were not consistent with normal use." "I see," said Miss Marple. "The police are looking, among other things, at what Mr. Crewe consumed on Thursday evening. Digoxin can be introduced in food or drink with relative ease, particularly if combined with certain other substances that affect its absorption rate." He looked at her steadily. "Miss Marple, are you in a position to tell the police anything useful?" "I believe I may be," she said. "I intend to speak to them this afternoon. There is one more thing I need to establish first." The one more thing was the substance of the filing cabinet. Simon Crewe had told her that the cabinet had been opened and some papers might have been removed. What he had not told her, because she had not yet asked, was what remained. She rang him from Dorothy's telephone at midday. "The file," she said. "App queries. You said it contained 8 months of correspondence. Can you tell me whether any of the correspondence was with a third party not Plim? Not your father, but someone else? A solicitor, perhaps, or a bank?" There was a pause on the line while Simon apparently went to look. "There are copies of letters to someone at a bank in Taunton," he said, when he came back, dated 6 weeks ago. "And a reply." "I can read you the reply, please," she said. He read it. It was brief. It confirmed that a designated account number given in the letter had received a series of transfers from a pooled investment fund administered by Mr. A.J. Plim, and that the account was held in the name of a limited company registered in Jersey, and that on inquiry the company's sole director was registered as 1S. T. Crewe, S. T. Crewe, Simon said very quietly. "That's me, Simon Thomas Crewe." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "I thought it might be." A long pause. "He set me up," Simon said. "Plim set me up. That's what my father found. That's why he didn't know whether to trust me." "Yes," she said again. "And that, I think, is why he had to die before Friday." Chapter 12. The shape of the thing she went to the police at 3 o'clock. The local station was a small building on the road toward the county town, staffed by a sergeant named Hallett, who had the weathered patience of a man accustomed to rural crime in its traditional forms: sheep, boundary disputes, the occasional heated matter involving a right-of-way, and who regarded this particular matter with the alert unease of someone who has just been handed something considerably larger than expected. With him was a detective constable from the county force, a young woman named Webb, who took notes in the rapid, unobtrusive manner of someone who had learned that the person who takes good notes is always the most useful person in a room. Miss Marple laid out what she knew. She did not speculate. She did not theorize beyond the evidence. She stated the facts in the order in which they connected to each other, and allowed the connections to speak for themselves, which is, she had always found, considerably more persuasive than any amount of dramatic conclusion drawing. Arthur Pym had been misappropriating funds from the investment club for an indeterminate period. He had done so by routing transfers through a company registered in Simon Crewe's name, a company Simon knew nothing about, established using documents that could be forged and a signature that could be copied. If the fraud were discovered, Simon would appear to be the author of it. Gerald Crewe, uncovering the bank correspondence, had initially suspected his own son. But Gerald Crewe was thorough. He had kept digging. And he had found something that cleared Simon, she did not yet know what, but something that distinguished the genuine trail from the planted one. That was the additional day he had needed. That was what he had been preparing to tell his son on Friday evening. Arthur Pym had known the timeline. He had telephoned Gerald on Thursday morning. He had come to the house Thursday evening, bringing or having arranged something that would increase the digoxin already in Gerald's system to a fatal level. He had then, presumably, spent some time in the house before leaving long enough to open the filing cabinet, perhaps remove what seemed most dangerous, perhaps stop the clock, perhaps not. The clock, she said, and explained it. If the clock had been wound Thursday evening as usual, it would have run correctly through Friday and been found correct by Mrs. Greer, but it had shown 6:15. A clock wound on Thursday evening would not stop at 6:15, it would run for at least 30 hours. So either it had not been wound that evening, which was out of character for Gerald Crewe, or someone had stopped it, or someone had altered it. The most likely reading, it had been stopped, perhaps accidentally knocked, perhaps deliberately sometime Thursday evening when Arthur Pym was in the house, and Pym had not noticed or had not thought it mattered. Small things. They are rarely only themselves. The account, Sergeant Hallett said slowly. In Simon Crewe's name, the police should be able to trace how it was established the date of registration, the documentation used. If it was established before Simon introduced Pym to the group, it becomes rather more significant. If it was established after, it still indicates premeditation, but of a different kind. Deke Webb looked up from her notes. Would you be willing to speak to the detective inspector when she arrives? She's coming from the county town this evening. Of course, Miss Marple said. I should also suggest speaking again to Mrs. Vine, who has rather important information about Thursday lunchtime, and to Simon Crewe, who I believe will be entirely cooperative once he understands what his father actually found. She stood to leave, then paused. One more thing. There is a substance not grapefruit that significantly increases the absorption of digoxin, and would not necessarily be detectable as anything other than a flavouring in a drink. Arthur Pym has been, by all accounts, the kind of man who manages social situations carefully. The kind who brings wine or offers whiskey with the ease of long habit. Your forensic people should know to look. Chapter 13. Before the evidence speaks, the detective inspector was a woman of perhaps 45 named Cromer Tall, calm-faced, with the quality of someone who has heard many explanations in her career and has learned to listen to all of them without revealing which she finds credible. She arrived at Wisteria End at 7 o'clock, after spending an hour with Sergeant Hallett and DK Webb. Dorothy made tea with a natural grace that conveyed both welcome and an understanding that this was not a social call, and then excused herself to the garden on the grounds that her knee needed the air, which was kind and considered of her. Inspector Cromer sat down with her tea and asked Miss Marple to tell her everything from the beginning. Miss Marple did so. She was, she had always found, better at beginnings than most people assumed. She began with Wednesday afternoon and Gerald Crewe at his gate, which seemed to Inspector Cromer perhaps an odd starting point, but which she did not interrupt. When Miss Marple had finished, the inspector was quiet for a moment. The clock, she said, stopped or moved. I believe stopped. A man living alone on a regular schedule with a consistent medication routine would die at a predictable time if the dose were correctly calculated. If he took his digoxin in the evening with whatever Pym gave him, whatever enhanced the absorption and the dose was calibrated, then Pym may have had a reasonable sense of when. And a clock stopped at 6:15. If Gerald normally went to bed at 10 and died closer to 9, creates a mild confusion about timeline that may have seemed useful. Or it was simply an accident the clock was knocked. Plim left in some agitation after realising what he'd done. The clock simply stopped, and he didn't notice, which would make it more incriminating, not less, Inspector Cromer observed. Exactly, if he'd planned every detail, he would have checked the clock. The fact that he didn't suggest to me that this was not the act of a perfectly composed criminal, it was the act of a frightened man who had made a decision in a hurry and executed it less cleanly than he might have wished. The inspector made a note. We've already applied for a warrant to examine Plim's financial records. The Jersey Company connection is significant. Our financial crimes unit knows the pattern. Simon Crewe, Miss Marple said. He is not involved in the fraud. I am quite certain of that. And I think, when you speak to him about his father, you will understand why Gerald Crewe loved him despite everything, and why he needed one more day. Inspector Cromer looked at her steadily. You're rather remarkable, if you don't mind my saying so. Not at all, said Miss Marple, without particular pleasure in the compliment, because she had never found the remark especially apt. It was not that she was remarkable. It was simply that she had lived a long time in a village and paid attention. Human nature did not change. The geography changed, the names changed, the methods changed, but the fears and the vanities and the desperate calculations, those, were the same as they had ever been. She thought briefly of Mr. Haverstock, the churchwarden from St. Mary Mead, 30 years ago, who had defrauded the flower fund and when discovered had reacted with the same particular combination of denial and deflection that she had seen, though more seriously enacted, in Arthur Plim's manner on the street. The scale was different. The substance was identical. The file in the cabinet, she said. Whatever Plim removed, if he removed anything, may not be critical. Because Gerald Crewe was a thorough man. A man who kept files about other people's accounts keeps copies. Somewhere in that house, or with that solicitor he was going to see on Friday morning, there is a duplicate. We'll find it, the inspector said, and said it with the simple confidence of someone who meant it. Chapter 14. A conversation in the garden on Saturday morning. With the light coming low and golden across Dorothy's garden and the Clematis making its quiet lavender statement against the stone wall, Miss Marple sat in the garden chair with her knitting and thought about Gerald Crewe. Not about the case that was now with the people best placed to pursue it. And she had a settled confidence that they would. Inspector Cromer had been impressive. Deekwebb's notes had been thorough. The forensic examination of whatever Plim had served Gerald that Thursday evening would, she expected, find what it found. She thought instead about Gerald Crewe the person. A precise man. A careful man, a man who wound his clocks and kept his files and managed his affairs with an orderliness that had sometimes made others, the vicar, apparently feel examined. A man who had been, in the matter of his own son, unable to separate the evidence from the emotion clearly enough to act quickly. Who had needed that extra day, not for the facts, but for the heart. He had not got it. He had been denied that final clarity by a man who was afraid of being exposed. It seemed to Miss Marple one of the sadder species of injustice, not dramatic, not theatrical, just the quiet stealing of a thing that was not very large, but was irreplaceable. A Thursday evening. A conversation that never happened. A Friday that never arrived. Simon came at 10 o'clock. Dorothy had telephoned him the night before, after the inspector left, on Miss Marple's suggestion, not with detail, simply with an invitation. He looked different again. Less hollowed. There was something in his face that was not quite settled, but had the beginnings of settlement in it, the look of a man who has been told a difficult truth that is nevertheless better than the versions his own imagination had produced. He believed me, Simon said, sitting in the other garden chair with his coffee cup. At the end, the solicitor confirmed it this morning. Dad had left a letter with him, to be opened after his death. In it he says that he's satisfied Simon had no knowledge of the account. That Plim used information from a form Simon signed at the initial investment meeting to establish the company. He found the original form. He'd matched the details. He paused. He spent 2 days being unsure of me, and then he spent the rest of the time gathering proof that I was innocent. Miss Marple looked at the Clematis for a moment. "He was your father," she said. Yes, Simon looked down at his cup. He was going to tell me Friday evening. Everything. He was going to, I think, he was going to apologise. For the 2 years, even though it wasn't really his fault. It is possible to be the origin of a wrong and still owe an apology, Miss Marple said gently. He knew that. That was the sort of man he was. Simon was quiet for a while. The garden held the morning light carefully. A robin had appeared on the wall and was considering the dahlia bed with the alert calculation of a small creature planning several moves ahead. "The clock," Simon said after a while. "The police told me about the clock. Why would Plim have touched it?" "I don't think he planned to. I think he was in the room and he was not steady. One is not steady after doing something terrible, and he knocked it, or moved it, and it stopped. And in his state he didn't register the significance. Small accidents are very useful things, in the end." Simon nodded slowly. "He's been arrested," he said. "This morning. Inspector Cromer rang me." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "I thought she might have." She picked up her knitting. "And now," she added, with the tranquillity of someone for whom this moment was always the natural conclusion, "there is rather a lot of morning left. Would you care for more coffee?" Chapter 15. The Clematis on the wall the second week of Miss Marple's fortnight at Chipping Hurst was, by comparison to the first, agreeably quiet. Arthur Plim had been charged with the murder of Gerald Crewe and with a range of financial offences that the county's fraud team were, according to Inspector Cromer in a brief and businesslike phone call, finding rather more extensive than initially estimated. The Jersey Company was one of 3. The investment club losses were significant but not the largest component. There were other victims in other places who had not yet put names to what had happened to them. He had been, it emerged, precisely what Miss Marple had thought, a frightened man acting in a hurry. The substance found in the whisky glass in Gerald Crewe's sitting room, a glass that Plim had touched. Because it was the glass Plim had poured and brought to his host, was a flavouring compound that interacted with digoxin with well-documented and predictable severity. It had been purchased 6 months earlier, on a day Plim had visited a certain pharmacy in the county town, on a matter he described to the pharmacist as an interest in natural food preservation. The pharmacist remembered him because he had asked an unusually specific question. The file in the cabinet had not been significantly disturbed. Plim had opened it, looked through it in some agitation, and then, apparently faced with the thoroughness of what Gerald had assembled, had simply closed it again and left. Perhaps he had calculated that he could not remove enough to make a material difference. Perhaps he had simply lost his nerve. The clock, as Miss Marple had suspected, had been stopped accidentally. His elbow, the forensics suggested. He had reached past it for something on the mantelpiece and caught it, and in the state he was in had not noticed, or had noticed and not cared. Or had noticed and made the error of thinking it didn't matter. Small things. Never only themselves. Dorothy's knee improved daily. By the second Wednesday she was walking to the post office under her own power, which pleased her enormously, and pleased Mrs. Partridge equally, as it restored their customary daily exchange. "That Miss Marple of yours, Mrs.?" Partridge said to Dorothy, on one such morning in Miss Marple's hearing, though not addressing her directly village manners operating with their usual subtle protocols. "She's a quiet one, isn't she?" "She is," Dorothy agreed, with the satisfaction of someone whose judgment has been publicly confirmed. "Quiet in an observant way," Mrs. Partridge said. "Not the same as quiet in a not-noticing way." "No," said Dorothy. "Not remotely the same." Miss Marple said nothing, because there was nothing to add to this that would improve it. Simon Crewe came to say good-bye on the Thursday before her departure. He was sorting the estate, working with the solicitor, dealing with what needed dealing with. He looked, she thought, like a man who had been given something difficult and had decided to carry it properly rather than put it down. "He left it all to me," Simon said. The house. Everything. He'd updated the will 6 months ago, round about when he first started suspecting Plym, I think. As if he was putting things in order, just in case. He was a thorough man, Miss Marple said. He was. Simon paused. I'm going to keep the house for a while. I'm not sure what I'll do with it in the end. But I want to spend some time there first. Get to know it properly. He glanced at the garden. He had a clematis, you know. At the back. Not in bloom now, but apparently in September it's quite something. Clematises often are, said Miss Marple pleasantly. He shook her hand with a warmth that said more than the handshake itself contained, and went. On Friday morning, her last full day, Miss Marple sat in the garden with her final cup of wisteria end tea, and looked at the clematis on the wall. It had 3 flowers remaining, the rest had gone over now, retreating into themselves with the dignified inevitability of autumn. She thought about Gerald Crewe, who had wound his clocks and kept his accounts and loved his son imperfectly, and tried at the end to be the kind of man his son deserved. She thought about the clock that had stopped at 6:15, which had been the accident that undid a carefully managed deception. She thought about Arthur Plym, who had built a life out of other people's trust, and then destroyed a man to protect it. And she thought, as she often did after these matters resolved themselves, that there is very little in human behaviour that is entirely new. The forms change, the technology changes, the particular details are always specific to their moment, but the essential architecture, the person who takes what is not theirs, the person who must be silenced, the small careless error that speaks more clearly than any confession that architecture is as old as there have been people in villages, which is to say, as old as there have been people. She finished her tea. The last clematis flower, she noticed, had opened since breakfast. She picked up her knitting and settled more comfortably in the chair, and the garden held the morning warmly, and the church bell at St. Cuthbert's rang the hour at exactly the right time, as it always did, as it would go on doing long after everyone who currently lived within its sound had become, themselves, a matter for the past.